Maria, you look like you have something to add now.
Yeah, and I too am just so thankful to OPC, and thank you for this extraordinary award, and to Kate, congratulations, and to Carlos, you are an example of great journalists continuing the work. So I certainly am a great admirer of yours. A couple of things just from my own reporting on this side, I would add, and I know that Carlos, you're going to be like, oh, right, of course, which is sexual violence and violence against women that is unrelenting. I mean, people in the United States are familiar with stalking. This is like stalking at a whole other level because of the total impunity in terms of the police. So sexual violence and just domestic violence in general. And then violence against the LGBTQ and trans community, where people really feel like they cannot, as Carlos said, they cannot live anymore. And also, I think it's really, thank you, Carlos, for starting out by saying people are leaving their homes. If I could catch a flight right now, which I'm not going to do, but I could. So, I could. I want to go to El Salvador because I think it's and Honduras and Guatemala, because I think it's very important for people to realize, and when I'm allowed to talk about this, on cable television, certainly we do this all the time on Latino USA and in the thick, but these are not millions of people leaving their homes. O sea, there are millions of Salvadoreños who understand that it's a challenge to live in their country, absolutely, because of the United States destabilizing a country like El Salvador for over 100 years, and the most recent for everything that Carlos said. Yes, there will be people who will be like, I can't do anything else but leave. But there are many people who are not leaving. And it's important for the United States to and for the American media to understand that this has been happening for decades. Shame on the United States for having an absolute myopic, total lack of preparation for a humanitarian crisis that they know full well. Everything that Carlos just said, they know in the State Department and the CIA. They absolutely know this. So shame on them for frankly, their lack of humanitarian care for people who are desperate. But this is not new. The level of horror has certainly increased, but it's not new. And I think we need to understand, again, there are not several million people on the border that are, overrunning a wall in swarms. We need to stop all of that language that our colleagues use, frankly, because of their laziness. Because I'm old enough to have been around, you too, Carlos, reporting on the war in Central America, in El Salvador, that this country was funding. So for journalists to not give context is one of the most irresponsible things, and we are all living the consequences, hence why we have to have these kinds of conversations.
Kate, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I think, as has already been said, I'm super humbled to be among such amazing journalists, and they've said so many important things. And so yes to what Carlos and Maria are already sharing. I think, my travels took me more to Honduras and Nicaragua, so I can speak more to what's happening there. And then I can speak to, what I hear from people when they arrive here at our border, where I'm situated at the San Diego Tijuana border. In Honduras, I think it's also important to note how much US business benefits from the economic gaps there. When you drive around in Honduras, you see US flags on a lot of the factories that people work at, where they make almost nothing, and they work, 6 days a week making almost nothing. And And so, the person who I wrote about in the piece that you all recognized was someone who had decided to be a moto taxi driver because at least he could make somewhat of a wage doing that instead of working in the factories where his siblings worked. And that's a much more dangerous job because you're crossing through all of these territories that are run by these different groups, whether it's gangs or cartels or mix, and especially if you're traveling through contested areas, it's an incredibly dangerous job, and you're often targeted because of being asked to transport things for the gangs, or being asked to pay the rent to the gangs in order to pass through their territory. And so as this individual chose not to do some of those things that the gangs were asking him to do, and he was in an area that was being contested, his life was in danger. He became threatened. He came here to the United States. We rejected him. And when he went back, he chose to go back to that same job because that was the only job where he could make money to help his family. That was the only path that he saw there. And he ended up getting killed about a year after he was deported and rejected from the United States. And so I think that danger, it gets talked about so much in a very sort of nonchalant, like, oh, the danger and the gangs, but that the realness of that and the human impact of those decisions that people are having to make, like, well, do I work the job that doesn't pay me enough to buy food, or do I work the job where I can buy the food but I might get killed, or do I go on this journey where I might die in the process, but maybe I could have better access to a job and that is not putting me in danger to get killed, and I can also buy food, And so I think a lot of times too, we have this conversation where so much of Central American migration and migration from Mexico is talked about in economic terms, but the way that is tied into the violence and the way that that's tied into the corruption and how that's all layered together in this very complex web that is causing these life-threatening conditions and these desperation, I don't think we get at that nuance enough. And so I guess that would be what I would want to add. And then just to remember too, that not only are there all of these things going on, but there are also people who are speaking up against the corrupt politicians, speaking up against the political situations in these countries. And I'm thinking especially now of Nicaragua as well, where the protests in 2018, there were pro-democracy protests against the Ortega regime. And people very much are putting their lives in danger in order to speak out in that way. Hundreds of people have been killed in Nicaragua because they chose to speak out. And so we do also see a lot of people coming with very, I guess, sort of like textbook political asylum cases, but they're not being treated that way.